Hello, and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Today's story is titled The Enigma of Giza, Pharaohs, Sphinx, and Extraterrestrial Connections. Following the quiet mysteries of long-lost tombs, impossible architecture, and otherworldly theories under the desert stars. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. Part 1: The Enigma of the Giza Plateau. The wind moved gently across the dunes, whispering over sand that had not stirred in millennia. Under a blanket of stars, the Giza Plateau rested like a memory pressed deep into the earth. From afar, the Great Pyramids rose, not as monuments, but as quiet puzzle shapes, too precise, too aligned, too permanent to be mere graves. It was here, in this sacred geometry, that wonder took root. Long after the last torch of the ancient builders was extinguished, scholars and seekers returned, blinking beneath the hot sun, asking questions that refused to settle. Why had the ancients built these colossal structures? And more curiously, there are those who believe the pyramids were simply tombs, ordered by vain kings, and shaped by tens of thousands of laborers. Yet others whisper of something far older, far stranger. The notion that this plateau was not built out of impulse, but according to a master plan, intelligent, deliberate arrangement tied to the stars. The three pyramids at Giza, some noticed, mirrored Orion's belt, not approximately but precisely. Their layout reflected not just the star pattern, but the relative brightness of the stars themselves. This alignment wasn't something a civilization could stumble into by stacking stones. It suggested purpose, knowledge, perhaps, outside influence. The plateau has always hidden more than it revealed. Beneath the sand, tunnels twist and chambers vanish into darkness. Ancient texts hint at passages lost and sealed for reasons unknown. But something lingered in those spaces, a feeling, a presence, the kind that tickled the skin when no breeze blew. It was easy to imagine ancient priests standing in long rows, chanting as stars shimmered above. But it was harder to explain why. The base of the Great Pyramid was accurate to a fraction of an inch. Harder still to ignore that its sides aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal points north, south, east, and west. These were feats of precision, not poetry. At night, the plateau sang a different song. Insects hushed, wind ceased, and the silence deepened. Some said they'd seen strange lights from afar, hovering silently over the great stones. Locals brushed it off with weary shrugs, as though the land had always been this way, half awake, half dreaming. The Great Pyramid itself had no inscriptions inside, no hieroglyphs, no records, no markings of ownership. Unlike the richly decorated tombs of other pharaohs, this one was mute, as if the builders had no need to explain, or perhaps they weren't from here. Dr. Layla Samir, a modern Egyptologist with a fondness for chamomile tea and soft leather notebooks, once said to a colleague, "If we discovered the Giza complex today, with no context of ancient Egypt, we would assume it was the work of an advanced civilization, not primitive, not even medieval, but something futuristic." She laughed when she said it, but her eyes didn't. That wasn't to say ancient Egyptians weren't brilliant. They were. Their knowledge of astronomy, architecture, and spiritual symbolism remains impressive. But something about Giza pressed against the limits of that brilliance. It felt inherited, like finding a spaceship in a scrapyard throughout. The 20th and 21st centuries, archaeologists used new tools to scan beneath the surface: ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging. Even Moyne detectors all pointed to voids and cavities, unexplained by the existing map. Beneath the paws of the Sphinx, beneath the pyramid of Kafir, something waited. A joke among the research teams went, if the walls could talk, they'd ask where we've been. And if Giza was designed by someone else, perhaps even not of this earth, the design had worked. The pyramids had lasted through storms, invasions, earthquakes, and empire after empire. Their edges, though weathered, remained defiantly sharp. Their shadows still fell with geometry you could set your watch by, and so the question lingered, like sand caught in the hem of a robe. Was this place simply the height of human effort, or was it a marker left behind like a business card from travelers long gone? The boy selling trinkets near the Sphinx swore his grandfather once saw a ship land near the plateau. A craft, he said, made of light, humming like a flute. But when pressed for details, the boy just smiled and waved his hands, either unwilling or unable to explain. Giza has always been Giza, he said, as though that were answer enough. Too many, it is, but to others, the whispers of forgotten engineers and impossible timelines continue to tug at the edge of dreams. The deeper they dig, the more strange the ground becomes. The more questions arise. Was the plateau mapped from the sky? Were the builders guided by those who lived among stars? Was Giza an observatory, a transmitter, a portal, or a message in stone, meant for whoever finally learned to listen? The answers, it seemed, were hidden in plain sight, or perhaps not hidden at all, lonely, waiting for the right night, the right dreamer, the right kind of silence, a silence like this one. Part 2. The Sphinx and its silent secrets. She sat low to the earth, paws stretched out, as if protecting something unseen. The great Sphinx of Giza, weathered by thousands of years, had watched centuries come and go, her expression unchanged. Yet even without movement, her face whispered stories, and many suspected those stories were not entirely human. There was something odd about the Sphinx. Unlike most monuments in Egypt, her age remained a mystery. Traditional Egyptologists placed her construction around 2500 BCE, likely commissioned by the pharaoh Kafir, but not everyone agreed. Some geologists, studying the deep vertical erosion on her flanks, noted that only thousands of years of heavy rainfall could have caused such patterns. Rainfall Giza hadn't seen since the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE. That was well before the known rise of Egyptian civilization. So, if the Sphinx was older than the civilization that claimed her, who built her? It was the kind of question that made people uncomfortable. But to others, it was an invitation. Beneath the Sphinx, beneath her paws, specifically modern scanning had revealed the presence of chambers, hollow spaces sealed off long ago, their contents unknown. Despite this, they had never been fully excavated. Theories about these hidden rooms varied wildly. Lost records of Atlantis, buried alien artifacts, even a hall of records containing humanity's true history in quiet corners of the internet and dusty university basements. Researchers passed around old photos. Infrared images showed rectangular voids. Legends from the ancient Hermetic texts spoke of a hidden library beneath the lion, and certain satellite images, enhanced and filtered, seemed to show linesmen directly from the base of the Sphinx toward the pyramids. Could it have been a map, a circuit, a celestial machine meant to communicate with the heavens? Layla Samir once joked during a symposium, if the Sphinx had a voice, I don't think it would be in any language we speak. She had meant it metaphorically, of course, but many nodded. There was another oddity, the head. It was disproportionately small for the body, almost as if it had been recarved. Some believed the original head was not that of a pharaoh, but something else, perhaps a lion, in keeping with the body, or ... something entirely different. Imagine for a moment, the Sphinx's had not the rounded features of a human, but something longer, larger, maybe even elongated. Not unlike the stylized skulls found in certain pre-Columbian cultures, or the Amarna art under Akhenaten, a stretch, perhaps, but when strange patterns repeat across continents and centuries, people begin to ask, is it all coincidence? One theory suggested the Sphinx was never meant to be seen alone, that it was once the crown jewel in a complex astronomical system. At specific times of the year during equinoxes and solstices, the Sphinx's gaze aligns with rising celestial bodies, most notably the constellation Leo, the lion. That coincidence, again? What if the Sphinx was meant to look homeward, not to Earth, but to the stars? In Egyptian mythology, gods came from the sky. Osiris descended from Orion, Isis from Sirius. The Sphinx, locked in her eternal gaze toward the east, may have served as a guardian not of tombs, but of knowledge, some gifted, some forbidden. There's an old tale, passed down from a guide's grandfather's grandfather. It tells of a storm that once uncovered a metal object beneath the Sphinx's paw, silver, smooth, and humming faintly. According to the tale, it was taken by officials in the night. No trace of it was ever found again. When tourists stood before the Sphinx today, they saw a silent, majestic creature. But researchers saw clues: a body of granite, a head resculpted, eyes too eroded to read, but positioned too precisely to ignore. In 1993, a team from Florida State University, working with the Egyptian Antiquities Authority, used ground-penetrating radar around the base. Their findings showed rectangular anomalies, some exactly beneath the Sphinx. The world waited for excavations that never came. Theories multiplied. What if beneath the Sphinx lay technology, or records not etched in stone, but encoded in ways only advanced tools could decipher? Some even proposed that the Sphinx wasn't originally built by humans, but revealed and covered from beneath the sands by early Egyptians, who then added their own touches, inscriptions, and myths to it. In this version of the story, the Sphinx predates known history entirely. And what of the face? Was it ever human? Or was it something else? Something sculpted to resemble a being who once stood upon that same plateau and looked up at the same stars. A tourist once dropped her camera near the Sphinx. It slid into a crack between the paws. She returned days later to search for it, but was told the area was sealed for restoration. Her story would have gone unnoticed except when she described what was on her camera: a strange reflection, caught in the dusk light, of something glowing faintly just beneath the stone. Skeptics scoffed. Cameras glitch, people imagine, but the desert doesn't forget. And the Sphinx, with her wind-scoured eyes and enigmatic smile, continues to sit in judgment of every theory, every ambition. Layla once said, "The Sphinx does not keep secrets. She simply refuses to speak until we're ready." And so, each night, the sand curls at her base, the moon rises behind her back, and somewhere, beneath the weight of stone and time, something waits. Part 3: Hidden Structures and Lost Technology Beneath the Sand. As the morning sun stretched golden fingers across the Giza Plateau, a quiet hum of anticipation buzzed through the minds of those who believed that what was visible above ground was only part of the story. The stones were impressive, yes, but it was the silence beneath them that many found most compelling. Long-rumored tunnels, voids, and chambers snaked through the bedrock below the pyramids, their presence confirmed by modern scanning but still inaccessible to curious hands. Among the most mysterious was the so-called Osiris Shafton underground complex near the Sphinx. First accessed in recent times through a deep vertical shaft, it descended through 3 levels, the lowest of which was submerged in water. At the very bottom lay an empty granite sarcophagus. No inscriptions, no markings, just silence. Theories rushed to fill the void. This wasn't a tomb, Layla Samir had once whispered as she examined a schematic of the shaft. It's a machine or the housing of one. Her colleagues had chuckled politely, but one had leaned closer and asked, "What kind of machine?" Layla only smiled, and indeed, what kind of machine would be buried 100 feet beneath the earth, beneath a plateau already filled with wonders? Some believed the shaft was part of a vast energy network, perhaps a capacitor or a system designed to regulate something far larger. The material composition was interesting too. Granite, rich in quartz, which has piezoelectric properties. Under stress, quartz can generate an electric charge. That alone didn't prove anything. But combine that with the pyramid's shape, mathematically precise, internally aligned to geographic true north, and suddenly you had something that looked less like a burial monument and more like a structure designed to manipulate energy. Stranger still were the tunnels allegedly connecting various points beneath the plateau. Some said they stretched from the Sphinx to the pyramids. Others suggested they extended even farther, linking Giza to underground chambers beneath Saqqara, or even as far south as Abu Simbel. These stories, dismissed by mainstream Egyptology, persisted in the margins. Satellite imaging and LiDAR scans had revealed faint patterns in the sand lines, too regular to be natural, as though foundations or conduits once lay just beneath the surface. Artifacts unearthed in nearby tombs added to the puzzle. A handful of items, mostly dismissed or ignored, showed unusual craftsmanship: tubes made of unknown alloys, stones carved with unnerving precision, and hieroglyphs that seemed to reference tools and lights. Despite the lack of soot on ceilings where torches would have burned, Egyptians didn't use candles underground. They didn't use oil lamps in the narrowest tombs. So how did they see? A peculiar discovery by an independent researcher named Amira Boulos gave some a chill. While studying carvings in a temple at Dendera, she found depictions of what looked eerily like electrical devices, bulb-like shapes connected to coiled lines, being offered by priests. Some laughed it off as stylized lotus flowers. Others weren't so sure. But it wasn't just the symbolism. It was the absence of basic things. No signs of smoke damage in the Great Pyramid. No soot trails. No scorched stone, maybe. They didn't need fire. Or maybe the pyramids weren't dark at all. One theory, gaining traction in fringe circles, was that the Great Pyramid was a power plant. It involved the movement of water, some suggested from the Nile, through chambers lined with limestone and granite, acting as conductors and insulators. Vibrations created a harmonic frequency. Quartz inside the pyramid's core activated under stress. Electricity, they believed, could be harvested. Of course, no wires were ever found. But then again, copper oxidizes and disappears over millennia. And what if the energy wasn't for human use at all? What if it wasn't energy in the way we understand it? A soft breeze stirred dust through an old air shaft, one that had no practical function. It didn't ventilate. It didn't point to stars by accident. One shaft, in particular, pointed directly at Orion's belt. Another to Sirius, too precise to dismiss, too odd to explain. What if those shafts weren't for air at all, but signal? Dr. Malik Hassan, an aerospace engineer turned fringe theorist, once proposed the idea that the shafts were part of a communications array, an ancient antenna using high-frequency resonance to send signals into space or receive them. He was laughed out of academia, but his diagrams remain online. The angles, the material choices, the alignment with constellations, it all pointed, he said, to a resonant interaction with non-terrestrial frequencies. A phrase that sounded beautiful, if nothing else. And then there were the robots. In the early 2000s, a small rover was sent into one of the pyramids, so-called air shafts. It encountered a stone door with copper handles. That alone was ode. We put a sealed door at the end of a useless shaft. When a second robot was sent in to drill through the door, it found another door, and behind that, unknown. Permission to continue has never been granted. What lies behind that second door? A portal, a record, a warning? No one knows, or if someone does, they aren't saying. But even the locals seem to sense the truth. An old guard once told a tourist, "At night, the ground hums. You have to stand still to feel it, but it's there, like something waking up." He said it like someone speaking of a childhood memory, not entirely understood, but deeply felt. And still, the Sphinx waits, and the pyramids shine, and beneath them, the silence continues, heavy with questions. Not empty, never empty, only ... waiting. Part 4. The pyramids as possible power plants. The desert heat shimmered around the Great Pyramid, its edges still razor-sharp despite the wear of centuries. Tourists snapped photos, vendors peddled miniature replicas. Yet for some, the true marvel of this colossal structure wasn't its size but its purpose. To the average eye, the Great Pyramid of Khufu was a tomb. But for those who dared to question, that explanation always felt lacking. There were no mummies found inside, no hieroglyphic inscriptions on the inner walls, unlike nearly every other pharaoh's resting place. And the sarcophagus, plain, empty, carved from a single block of granite, too large to fit through the pyramid's narrow corridors, meaning it had to be placed there during construction or before. Layla Samir, notebook always in hand, had once walked its grand gallery with a sense of reverence. She didn't believe this was a tomb, she believed it was a generator. It started with the materials. The outer casing stones, now mostly gone, were made of Tura limestone, highly reflective, almost radiant in appearance. The inner stones were granite, heavy with quartz. Beneath the pyramid lay a bedrock foundation lined with basalt. This combination, in modern electrical terms, looked suspiciously like an engineered system. Conductor, insulator, and base. Water was the key. At least, that was the heart of Layla's hypothesis. Beneath the plateau, she noted, were aquifers, natural underground rivers. As water flowed and vibrated beneath the pyramid, it could generate piezoelectric energy through the quartz-laden granite. Imagine an ancient civilization discovering that certain stones, under pressure, produced sparks or currents. Now imagine that civilization aligning its structures with electromagnetic nodes, ley lines, perhaps enhancing this energy. That idea might sound far-fetched, but not to the minds piecing together ancient blueprints hidden in plain sight. The internal design of the pyramid only deepened the mystery. The so-called King's Chamber, the largest internal room, was positioned precisely to receive the upward flow of vibrational energy. Its ceiling slabs, 5 of them stacked with strange separation, formed a resonant chamber. Acoustic tests, conducted in the early 2000s, revealed the room sang at specific frequencies, If sound could be harnessed, vibration amplified, could this chamber have functioned like a tuning fork for the entire structure? There were also those persistent shafts, the narrow tunnels pointing not at random, but at specific stars. Orion's belt, Sirius, the constellations associated with Osiris and Isis. Some saw in these alignments not just religious symbolism, but technical purpose. Perhaps they marked transmission channels, data vectors, or synchronization beacons. Think of the pyramid as a machine, a big one, a machine meant to generate focus and perhaps broadcast power, not through wires, but frequencies. Modern engineers studied this theory with cautious interest. The layout of chambers and passageways mirrored modern resonance circuits. Tesla himself had once mused that ancient structures might have tapped into the natural electrical potential of the Earth, harvesting and transmitting it wirelessly. Now, imagine Tesla walking into the Great Pyramid. He might have felt right at home, and yet the big question remained. Why build a power plant in 2500 BCE? For what purpose? For whom? Here, speculation grew bolder. Some believed the energy was used not for cities or lamps, but for something far older, something buried, something needing power. The Osiris shaft and its water-filled pit may have been part of a cooling or magnetic field stabilization system. Perhaps the energy stabilized portals, or perhaps it preserved knowledge holographically encoded chambers, waiting to be reactivated. One theorist, former systems engineer, once said with a smirk, "You don't build a power plant in the middle of a cemetery, you build it where it's needed." Something here needed power. He wasn't talking about light bulbs. There was even speculation about sound. Some researchers believed that chants inside the pyramid activated something resonance. Fields, sonic keys. Monks had used sound for centuries to alter consciousness. Maybe some thought that was the point. The pyramid wasn't built to bury the dead. It was built to wake the living. A tourist once whispered to his guide, "It hums when you stand alone." Inside, the guide shrugged. "Old stones remember music." It was a poetic answer, but it wasn't wrong. At night, the structure held its heat. It radiated, faint but constant, as if still alive. The walls remained perfectly aligned with the cardinal points. Its height multiplied by 1,000 gave you the polar radius of Earth. Its base perimeter, divided by twice its height, gave you pi. Its coordinates, oddly enough, almost exactly matched the speed of light in meters per second, 29.9792458. Coincidence? Or were the builders telling us something? Layla liked to believe they were. They didn't just build it for them, she'd told a colleague once. They built it for us. For when we were ready to understand, and maybe we were almost ready. What if the pyramid wasn't an end, but a beacon, a lighthouse left behind by visitors long gone, or perhaps just stepped away? And what if its real purpose, its true function, was never to bury the dead, but to awaken the sleeping? That night, a drone hovered quietly above the plateau, its infrared sensors blinking. Below, the granite blocks sat, absorbing starlight. The desert wind moved like breath across sand, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet frequency older than civilizations still resonated. Part 5. Contact from the Stars, Hieroglyphs, and Celestial Beings. The desert sky was velvet black, freckled with stars that twinkled in familiar patterns. Above the Giza Plateau, Orion's belt hung like a string of pearls, perfectly mirrored by the pyramids below. It wasn't a coincidence. It never had been. From the moment humans first looked skyward, they told stories of gods. But in the language of ancient Egypt, those gods often walked beside mortals, bringing gifts, offering wisdom, sometimes even demanding reverence. And in the carvings and hieroglyphs they left behind, hints of the extraordinary were etched into stone. At first glance, these were scenes of myth-tall beings, with animal heads, flying discs in the sky, elongated skulls, and glowing staffs. But when viewed with a different lens, these same images began to resemble something else entirely: modern helicopters, submarines, rockets, even stylized spacesuits. Tucked away in the Temple of Seti at Abydos was one such anomaly, a set of carvings that caused more than one archaeologist to raise their eyebrows. Among the hieroglyphs were images that looked eerily similar to a modern-day helicopter, a tank, and even a jet. Most dismissed them as examples of palimpsest layers of hieroglyphs carved over each other, coincidentally creating these shapes. A convenient explanation, yet it didn't quite settle the unease they stirred. Layla Samir once stood before those carvings, her fingers tracing the outlines. "We think they're stylized metaphors," she murmured. "But what if they're just ... accurate?" The ancient Egyptians described the gods as descending from the stars. The word Neteru was often translated as gods, but some scholars argued it meant watchers or guardians, beings from elsewhere, beings not bound to Earth. Take Thoth, for example. Depicted with the head of an ibis, he was the bringer of writing, science, and knowledge. But in certain inscriptions, he wasn't born on Earth, he came from the heavens, in a boat of millions of years. A poetic metaphor, perhaps, but the phrase echoed again and again through temple walls and ancient songs. The boat of millions of years was no ordinary vessel. It traveled the stars, glowing with radiant fire. It could pass through day and night, visible only to the initiated. Even Ra, the sun god, traveled across the sky in a luminous bark, sailing through the duat, the underworld, during the night. But if one looked closely, those stories often described the duat not as a mystical afterlife, but as a place between stars filled with gates, guardians, and cosmic hazards. One particular wall carving in the Temple of Hathor at Dendora showed a circular zodiac map of constellations so precise it included the precession of the equinoxes. That's a cycle of nearly 26,000 years. How could they have known? And there were more disturbing details. Among the less visited tombs in Saqqara was one belonging to a high priest named Tehotep. Along the ceiling ran inscriptions not just of stars, but of specific star systems, including Sirius, which the Egyptians called Sopdet, Sirius. They believed was where the goddess Isis came from. Modern astronomers only recently discovered Sirius is a binary system with a smaller companion star, Sirius B, something invisible to the naked eye, only confirmed in the 20th century. Yet the Dogon people of Mali, in West Africa, had long claimed knowledge of it, passed down orally, allegedly from sky visitors. When questioned, the Dogon said simply, "They told us." Back in Egypt, alien theorists suggested that elongated skulls found in certain mummy cases could be physical remnants of these visitors. The most famous skulls found in Paracas, Peru, were often compared to certain sarcophagi in Egypt where the craniums seemed unusually long. Skeptics cried cranial binding, but not all the skulls showed signs of shaping. Some were naturally structured, with different suture patterns. If these beings were real, if the Neteru were visitors, then the pyramids, the temples, the hidden shafts, all began to make more sense. Perhaps they were not built by human hands alone. Perhaps they were built by instruction or imitation. One mural in a minor shrine near Luxor showed a group of humans kneeling as three tall figures emerged from a circular object, descending with rays of light. The figures bore odd helmets, and their eyes were oversized and almond-shaped. A prank, a flourish of artistic liberty, or memory. The stars were not just distant twinkles to the Egyptians. They were destinations, homes, and perhaps doorways. When Layla once asked an elderly Bedouin guide what he thought the pyramids were, he had smiled, sun-wrinkled, and calm. "They are not tombs," he said. "They are points on a map. But the map is not for us." And what of the ancient stories detailing flying boats, glowing discs, beams of light that healed or destroyed? When viewed together, they formed not just mythology, but a chronology, a long, patient effort to preserve contact, or to wait for it to resume. Perhaps the gods weren't gods at all. Perhaps they were explorers, scientists, watchers who once walked among mortals, teaching what they could before vanishing into the sky, and maybe, just maybe, they left signs, hidden in stone, visible only to those willing to look beyond legend. At night, under the stars, the hieroglyphs still whispered. They said, "We were here. You are not alone." Part 6. The Ancient Astronaut Theory and Lost Technologies. As the stars drifted westward over the plateau, the air cooled and the desert sands fell still, like a theater awaiting its next act. Shadows stretched long across stone, tracing lines carved over millennia. And in those lines, some believed, lay the fingerprints of beings not of this earth. The ancient astronaut theory, though often dismissed in academic circles, persisted through whispers, conferences, and late-night documentaries. It suggested that humanity's leap from primitive to monumental wasn't made alone. According to this theory, someone or something helped, not from a hidden civilization or lost continent, but from the stars. And nowhere did this theory find more fertile ground than ancient Egypt. There were too many oddities, too many puzzles that didn't quite fit into the narrative of a civilization simply evolving on its own. The construction of the pyramids remained a central mystery. Stones, weighing multiple tons, were cut, transported, and placed with precision still hard to replicate with modern cranes and lasers. The limestone casing, once polished to such brilliance that the pyramids shone like mirrors under the sun, was aligned so perfectly to true north that some believed it must have been guided by celestial or technological calculations, well, beyond the reach of Bronze Age minds. But it wasn't just the pyramids, it was what surrounded them. Take the Temple of Hathor at Dendera. Inside one chamber, shielded from public view and often dismissed by official tour guides, lay a carving known as the Dendera Light. It showed a strange object, bulbous, with a serpent-like filament, held by figures and powered by what looked like a box and cable. To some, it looked strikingly like a modern electric light. Others laughed it off as symbolic. But Layla Samir had stared at that carving in silence, goosebumps rising on her arms. "If it walks like a light bulb," she whispered, "and glows like a light bulb." Then there were the batteries of Baghdad clay jars with copper rods inside, found across the Middle East. Their purpose was unclear, but when replicated with lemon juice, they produced voltage enough to power rudimentary devices. Were these relics of forgotten science or borrowed technology? Ancient Egypt had many such artifacts, granite vases carved from single blocks so hard that only diamond tools could replicate them today. Drill holes that spiraled too perfectly, marks that didn't match hammer and chisel. Some had been discarded by early archaeologists as too advanced to be ancient, tossed into storage without documentation. Others sat in museums, labeled with question marks, and always the stories persisted. Inscriptions described the Benbonstone, a capstone, said to have descended from the heavens. It pulsed with radiant energy, and from it came life, power, and knowledge. If real, could this have been a kind of technology, a transmitter, an engine, or even a beacon? Some speculated it had once sat atop the Great Pyramid itself, and that its removal marked the end of the connection. Others believed it had never truly left, merely hidden, cloaked by the passage of time and intentional obfuscation. One papyrus, partially destroyed in antiquity but carefully copied by a French explorer, told of a circle of fire descending from the sky, emitting a humming sound, causing panic among the scribes. It was recorded not as myth, but as history logged, like an eclipse, noted for its extraordinary nature. This wasn't unique to Egypt. Across the globe, ancient texts described beings descending in flying machines, speaking in voices like thunder, wielding light as a tool and weapon. And in nearly every instance, they were mistaken for gods, but gods who taught mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, medicine, and then left. Why? Some thought the visitors came to uplift humanity, nudging us forward, planting seeds that would one day bloom into modern knowledge. Others suspected Earth was part of a larger experiment, a farm of sorts, a waiting ground, and still others believed the technology left behind wasn't just misunderstood, was buried on purpose, in a vault, in a chamber beneath the sands. Perhaps beneath the Sphinx itself, rumors of a hall of records had swirled for decades, an underground library said to contain not scrolls, but glowing tablets, devices that stored vast knowledge from before the flood, from before memory scans. Conducted in the late 20th century, did suggest anomalies beneath the Sphinx's paws, voids, chambers, unexcavated. But the Egyptian authorities denied permission to dig further. Layla Samir had joined one such scan, her hand trembling as the radar echoed back a clear rectangular void. She hadn't slept for 3 nights afterward. Imagine, she thought, a chamber, sealed for 12,000 years. Imagine it opening not to dust and bones, but to cold, humming stone. Lights flickering to life as if they had waited. Machines awakening, but time had moved on. The knowledge of how to activate them if they were real had, perhaps, been lost, or worse, suppressed. Because if the ancient Egyptians had interacted with beings from another world, if they had used, borrowed, or inherited their tools, it meant rewriting everything: history, religion, the very idea of human uniqueness, and that Layla knew made people uncomfortable. The ancient astronaut theory was not embraced, it was tolerated, but beneath the surface it inspired a quiet awe and fear, because it asked a question too big for textbooks. What if we are not the peak of intelligence, but the echo? What if the pyramids are not monuments, but messages? Layla closed her journal that night beneath a canvas tent, staring up at the stars. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a whisper. She smiled softly. If they came once, she whispered, they can come again, and perhaps they already had. Part 7: Energy Portals, Star Maps, and Stargate Theories. The night pressed close around the ruins, silent and ancient. A soft wind stirred the dust near the pyramids, weaving around their base like smoke, as if the desert were remembering something far older than kings and pharaohs. From above, Giza resembled a celestial map: 3 pyramids, aligned with Orion's belt, their precision not just architectural, but astronomical. The alignment was exact. More than that, it was intentional. Ancient Egyptians weren't just builders. They were astronomers, philosophers, engineers of myth and matter. But what if the myths weren't metaphor? What if they encoded real technology's gateways, or stargates, capable of linking distant stars? That theory, long confined to science fiction and speculative thought, had taken root in a growing number of minds. And not without reason. There were carvings that showed swirling portals, circular devices ringed with symbols, stories of the doors of the Doyot gates in the underworld that opened at precise celestial times. And in some of those stories, mortals or beings called gods passed through them to other worlds, vanishing in a shimmer of golden light. To scholars like Layla Samir, these were more than tales. In a sealed chamber, deep beneath Saqqara, she had stood before a mural so detailed, so geometrically complex, that even mathematicians marveled. It wasn't just art, it was schematic. A blueprint, it showed concentric rings, interlocking like gears. Within them were star symbols, many of which matched constellations known to Dayon, some that did not. At the mural's center, a humanoid figure stepping through a circular frame, surrounded by radiant energy. The gates, according to the inscriptions, opened only when the stars were in precise alignment, and they required ... energy, not fire, not muscle, but something else. Was this the real function of the pyramids? Not tombs, not just observatories, but anchors, stabilizers for some ancient system designed to draw and focus energy from the earth itself. The Great Pyramid sat on powerful telluric lines, natural energy currents that flowed through the crust of the earth. Some cultures called them dragon lines or ley lines. The pyramid wasn't just placed, it was tuned, and inside it, shafts aligned with the stars. One pointed to Orion, another to Sirius. Channels, perhaps, or receivers. Ancient texts described sound chambers and vibrational harmonics. Priests were said to chant not just prayers, but tones that resonated through stone and air. Even modern researchers noted that the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid had peculiar acoustics. A whisper could echo like a song. When Layla stood in the chamber once, alone and still, she hummed a single note. The walls hummed back. It wasn't imagination, it was physics. She wondered if a certain frequency, chanted by human voice or activated by some unknown device, might once have triggered something else. A gate, a shift, a beam of light opening to the stars. Then there were the inscriptions about the field of reeds, a place the soul traveled after death. It was described not as vague spirit land, but a specific realm, one with rivers, fields, stars. Some scholars likened it to another planet entirely, and to reach it, the soul needed guidance, symbols, coordinates, star maps. Inside the tomb of Senunmet, architect to Queen Hatshepsut, was a celestial diagram so advanced it tracked planetary conjunctions, but tucked in its corners were strange symbols not Egyptian in form. They didn't match anything else from the period. Spirals, grids, lattice-like crystal diagrams. Were these alien inscriptions, or borrowed glyphs from a lost language? Some argued these symbols matched petroglyphs, found in far-off places, Australia, Bolivia, even Antarctica, as if knowledge had once circled the earth or been gifted to multiple points. Many stories spoke of a gate buried beneath the sand, not mythic, not poetic, literal, a device or structure that connected earth to the stars. The temple of Edfu told of a time before Egypt when the land was ruled by the builders of the sky. These beings came from a distant world, carried knowledge, and constructed the first sacred sites, according to the temple inscriptions. When their time ended, they sealed the sacred place, hiding the ladder to the stars so that it could only be opened by the worthy. And maybe that's what the Sphinx guarded. not just a monument, but a lock dot in the 1990s. Seismic surveys near the Sphinx uncovered rectangular anomalies beneath its paws, empty spaces, rooms. The data was clear, but the digging was stopped, permits denied. Why? Layla Samir had seen the scans. She'd touched the dusty printouts with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. "It's real," she whispered. "The chamber is real." Was that the Stargate? Or a control room for something even larger, something that spanned not just physical space, but dimensions? One untranslatable phrase from the pyramid texts haunted her, to Giza, roughly. It meant the sacred land of light, but others translated it differently. The radiant threshold, a doorway. There were too many coincidences, too many consistent tales across cultures and millennia, each pointing to gates, stars, and visitors from beyond. And maybe that was the greatest truth of all. The ancients weren't trying to mythologize. They were trying to remember, not worship, but preserve. They built in stone what they could not keep in memory. And maybe they left the gate behind, waiting for the right hands to open it again. As Layla watched the stars rise over the Nile, she whispered a soft promise. "If it still sleeps, I'll wake it." Part 8. Relaxation, Meditation, and the Eternal Night of the Stars. Layla stood still beneath the shadow of the Great Pyramid, her eyes soft as she gazed upward. The desert was hushed. Only the sound of wind brushing against stone could be heard, a sound older than words. The stars above gleamed like patient watchers from another time or another place entirely. And as you listen now, let your breath become as steady as the rhythm of the cosmos, in ... and out ... soft and slow, like the tide of the Nile in the moonlight, like the sands flowing through an hourglass carved in golden alabaster. Your eyelids grow heavier, your shoulders relax. Let yourself drift with the same stillness Layla felt as she looked up and saw not just stars, but a question written across the night. You are safe here, you are grounded, and yet you are part of something vast. Imagine yourself standing beside her in the cool desert breeze. You feel the earth beneath your feet, solid, ancient, enduring. The stones of the pyramid glow faintly in the moonlight, a silver hue wrapped in silence. You place your hand gently on the warm limestone. It hums with age, with memory, with secrets. The stars above you are alive. You know this, you feel it. As you breathe, imagine them pulsing gently with each inhale. Soft pulses, one for each breath. Inhale. Feel the pulse. Exhale. Feel the release. Your thoughts, your worries, drift upward, carried by the breeze like grains of sand. They rise toward the stars and dissolve. Now imagine looking up at Orion's belt, 3 bright stars, aligned like sentinels. Imagine them gently glowing brighter, their light cascading downward, not harsh, but comforting, like lanterns left by a long-lost friend. Their light touches your face, your hands, your chest. It feels like home. You are remembered, and Layla speaks softly, her voice a whisper barely louder than the wind. They never left, she says. They're just ... waiting. Let her words echo inside your mind, not as a puzzle, but a comfort, a lullaby from a time when gods walked with men, and the veil between heaven and earth was thin as gauze. Imagine now a staircase of light, unfurling from the apex of the pyramid. It's not solid, not cold, it's made of memory, of potential. Each step is a soft note in a forgotten song. You walk toward it slowly, not to escape, not to leave, but to remember, with each step you take, you feel lighter. Your chest unclenches, your breath deepens. Inhale, exhale, you feel the energy of the earth beneath you rooting you, and the gentle pull of the sky above lifting you. This is the balance, the harmony the ancients knew. Heaven and earth, body and spirit, flesh and starlight. You come to rest beside a large stone basin filled with still water. Layla is there, silent now. She gestures to the water. You look in, and you see yourself, not as you are, but as you were always meant to be. Peaceful, whole, part of the story. Your reflection glows softly, starlight in your eyes. And in that moment, you understand something. Not in words, but in feeling. The pyramids were never tombs. They were memory. The stargates were never doors. They were invitations. And the gods, beings who came in fire and wind, were never strangers. They were family, long lost or long departed, waiting to return, or waiting for you to awaken what they left behind. The water in the basin ripples gently as a breeze passes by. It smells like myrrh and desert blooms. Layla hums softly beside you an ancient melody without lyrics. The same song priests may have sung beneath the stars when the pyramids were young. Let it carry you now like a boat on the Nile. Inhale, exhale, you are safe. You are watched over. The universe is not empty. It is listening, and the desert timeless. Endless is a cradle for dreams not yet dreamed. As the stars shimmer gently above, the air grows cooler. The stone beneath your feet holds its warmth. The light from Orion fades slowly. You feel your eyelids grow heavier. Let go now. Let your thoughts drift like sand in the wind. Let your body sink into softness. Let your mind float gently between earth and sky. You're part of the great pattern, the sacred design. You always were. The pyramids rise around you, silent and strong, guardians of secrets, keepers of starlight. And as you fall into sleep, you hear Layla's whisper one last time. When you dream, she says, listen, you may remember. And then, silence, soft, eternal, only stars remain. Good night.